Welcome to Omtimes TV, a division of Omtimes Media and Broadcasting. Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on Omtimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandy Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome, and today we're going to be unravelling a conundrum that has been confusing, frustrating and dividing men and women since the beginning of time. And that is why, no matter how much time we spend together as work colleagues, friends, lovers, partners or relatives, we still don't understand how each other thinks, relates to and operates in the world. With me to throw some much-needed science-based light on this situation, a world-renowned expert on gender diversity and inclusive leadership, Barbara Annis, who's the author of several books on gender intelligence, including the very aptly titled Same Words, Different Language, and naturopathic medical doctor, research scientist, global health educator, and winner of the prestigious Hope Award for Prevention and Education in Behavioural Health, Dr. Donese Worden. Barbara Annis, Dr. Donese Worden, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Barbara Annis, if I might start with you, explain to me what gender intelligence is and why we need to develop this.
Well, gender intelligence is really the hardwiring of the brain of men and women. And what's really fascinating to me is that we didn't know that several years ago. So we didn't understand gender differences in the brain until 1990. Before that, we only studied male brains and male animals, which is insane. But the misunderstanding was that scientists just assumed that women were more or less the same as men, just a smaller version, other than the bikini factor. They actually called it that. And what they found was that there are some really profound, dramatic gender differences in how our brains are wired. And how that lands is that we misinterpret one another because we don't understand the differences in communication, in how we relate to one another, how we problem solve, how we think strategically, and so on.
This is an enormous topic, and I really can't describe how big it is, but it affects every single thing about us. We think that perhaps it's only in relationships or only in the workplace, but actually this impacts us on every single biological, psychological, emotional, and mental level as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it also impacts relationship in terms of our personal relationship. Like we know divorce rates is high in first divorce. Second, it's even higher. And third, it's even higher. So it's around 50% first marriages and between 70 to 72% second and the same in third. So it's not like we've sorted this out. We really misinterpret our differences. And the problem with that is we blame our differences, right? So we tend to blame men for literally breathing. Men tend to communicate and breathe differently. And if we don't know that we don't know that, we misinterpret people's intentions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And most of your work is done in the workplace. I mean, rather than personal relationships, although what you're working with, as you said, does affect us on every single level. What have you noticed recently? I mean, now that this evidence is here, are companies taking it on board more? And what is happening when they do?
Yes, companies have been taken on board since 1980. And what happened in the 80s was that they weren't able to keep women. So IBM, as an example, one of our first clients, had this study called Where Did the Women Go? So they were recruiting women in sales, but they had a 40% turnover and they didn't understand why. And the assumption was that women just went home, to have babies or do something else, which just wasn't the case. Only 7% of women who had left stayed home. So they then did some real serious deep dive work around this and found that it was actually the fact that women left because they didn't feel valued. They didn't feel valued for their authentic self that they brought to the workplace. They felt like they had to be more like an alpha male guy, so this is in the 80s, right? But I still see it in Silicon Valley today, where younger women, engineers, for example, in STEM, feel forced to be more that bro culture, part of that alpha culture. So that is the number one reason that why companies really take this on is that they want to fix this problem, right? They care and they want women to succeed. It's just that they don't know what they don't know. So that's why they hire us to fix it in partnership with them.
Dr. Donese Worden, I imagine that many viewers and listeners might be thinking that, yeah, I can grasp how a lack of understanding of gender differences can impact our work and personal relationships. But tell us, how does it impact our health?
Well, the anatomy and physiology of men and women are very different. So there's differences from your lung to your brain to your muscles, your ligament, and especially cardiovascular. It's a perfect example of how we've been trying to diagnose and treat the same diseases for men and women, and it's just not the case. So there's more and more science coming up, which is very exciting because women, we lay down plaque differently. Men put that cholesterol into large vessels. We go to small vessels. That means we're missing the boat when we're looking for cholesterol in the large vessels of women. We should be doing a different diagnostic test. We present differently, sometimes about 72% of the time, in a heart attack. We don't have necessarily the same symptoms as a male. That was missed for years, and we lost many lives because of it. In my opinion, I still see it going on. Women come in and they just think, oh, they have the flu or they've got nausea and sweating and vomiting. It's hormonal, go home. And it was actually a heart attack. So there are very big differences. Microbiome, we've been talking about that for a long time, the brain connection there. It's now a study called microgenderome. We know the microbiome is different. The bugs are different in how they communicate with hormones and the immune system. This is big, it is huge, and we are very different. And we need to study it more in medicine.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, I mean, stress is the number one killer. We know that. We live in a very stressful world. We're always being told that. But the biggest source of stress has got to come in these interactions. If we can't get on with one another at work, and if we can't get on with one another at home, there's the killer.
Yeah. And men and women, for their stress coping mechanisms, women generally turn to food, men turn to alcohol and smoking. It's different because our brains are different. And that's what Barbara is really bringing to light with all of her work, how different it is.
Mm.
in the
Well,
brain.
before we start looking at some of the differences, and it's really interesting to hear what men have to say about the things, the challenges they have with women and the challenges that women have with men. I want to know how you, Barbara, first got involved in this area of research and how you, Dr. Worden, wanted to work with Barbara on this.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I started actually my career at Sony, and I was the first woman in sales at Sony. And it was so interesting to me because I was very successful and I was very authentic with my clients. But inside of the culture at Sony, they thought I lacked confidence. And they said, even though you won, Salesman of the Year, they actually called it that, Rookie Salesman of the Year award and other awards, there's no bullet in your gun. So you need to be more assertive, more in your face kind of thing. So they sent me to training in San Francisco called Guerrilla War Tactics for Women in Business. And I learned all these very extreme alpha male behaviors. And I took it back to Sony and applied it. And then at the year end, my manager did the assessment, said she's become a very dangerous woman. So I started with, I lacked confidence, and then I displayed confidence, and now I was dangerous. So I realized there's something off here. So what I realized was that it was the culture that was actually just such a male culture, and women just didn't survive. I tried to hire one woman who lasted, her name was Joanne, and she lasted 1 year. And I remained the only woman for the 8 years that I stayed there. And I left with embarking on really understanding these differences from every aspect you can imagine, from nature to nurture, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, you name it. And my privilege in partnering with Dr. Worden or Donese has to do with the fact that we need to look at the whole person of both men and women. Because my sister-in-law, at age 38, died of a heart attack, just like Donese was just speaking about, on the front lawn of her house going into her car. And the Friday before, she was in urgent care saying she didn't feel good. She said, I feel awful. There's something wrong. And like Donese said, go home, take into Tylenol, and go to bed, drink fluids, you're good, right? So anyway, that's how we met, and that's how I embarked on this mission of mine for the last 30 years, 5 books later as well.
Well, having done many shows with you, Dr. Worden, I know that you are absolutely dedicated to the whole person approach. So it's not really surprising once we understand how this affects our biology. It's easy to see why you wanted to get involved with this.
It's just fascinating because Barbara brought to light the differences in the brain and what we understood. We do not learn gender intelligence in school. We learn neuroanatomy, how the brain basically works, but we are not taught the differences in the size, the structure, and the function of each one of those and how they are different in men and women. That's why Barbara's book was just so fascinating when I was reading through it and hearing her speak. That how are we not taught this in medical school? How is this not part of the picture? We already knew we should have been doing different labs because labs are based on 150-pound college-age male. We're using the same labs for a 60-year-old postmenopausal woman. It's just absolutely insane, in my opinion. Medically, this needs to change as well.
There's some good news I'd like to share about that I recently found out. Dr. Larry Cahill, neuroscientist, is finishing writing the first textbook for medical schools on gender differences in the brain. So that is a massive breakthrough, and he's incredibly thorough with a deep, deep knowledge of these differences. So hooray for that.
Yeah. Hooray for that.
Yeah. We've heard so much about equality in the workplace. Women now have equality, and what does that actually mean? Many women don't feel that they do have. They may have a similar position, but they are not listened to in the same way. And as you said, with your experience, if a woman becomes assertive, she's more likely to be called a little bulldog rather than, wow, there's a nice assertive person who can get things done.
Not that the three of us would know anything about that.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I remember I was the only female director among something like 10 directors in an advertising agency. And, you're doing equal work, but you are not getting equal attention and, even the rewards. So tell us some of the errors in our thinking I mean, what is it that men complain about most that they don't understand about women, and vice versa?
Yeah, so there are many areas, but I'll start with a few. One of the things that men are confused. Men don't know what the rules are, so they end up being careful. So, and what I mean by that is men are very rule oriented. If you just give me these 2 things or 3 things to do, I'll do them, right? But what they find often is that they operate on certain rules, or they've been brought up a certain way to be polite, open the door, lift heavy things, whatever. And now it seems to have changed from woman to woman. So it creates a lot of confusion around that. But if men are confused and careful, you can imagine how that lands for women in terms of men giving women feedback, as an example, right? And they're more cautious. They'll go straight to Bob and say, Bob, you should fix these 3 things. And then they'll go to Sandy and go, Sandy, how are you? How's your day? Soft pedal the feedback, right? And that can land as feeling dismissed or excluded, right? So you can see these challenges kind of just encourage one another. If we don't solve them, they just perpetuate continuously, right?
And it's not just between men and women in that regard. I remember reading Deborah Tannen's book many years ago, back in the 80s, I think it was, and being shocked at the realization that our culture, our parents, they train girls to talk differently than men do. And women are trained to have a much more conciliatory approach to men. And men don't understand when women are trying to be conciliatory, they often dismiss what the woman is saying because they're not aware of what it is she's doing.
Very nice. And that is what we see even today, even in younger generations, is that men tend to be much more directive and women tend to be more suggestive, right?
Yeah.
Collaborative and inclusive. So if they state an idea, they usually will ask for input of others before they give their idea. And men will do the exact opposite. Men will say, I have a brilliant idea and I think we should do it, right? And women are much more suggestive and inclusive. And that often gets dismissed. And I often use Madeleine Albright because we all know her. And she said, years ago, she said, it's so interesting to me. I over-prepare when I go to these all-male meetings. And I'll go in and I'll state my opinion. And it's not quite heard. And then 3, 4 chairs down, it's restated by a man. And it's brilliant. And it's heard. And I'll say, didn't I just say that? I thought I just said that. Right. And but men didn't pick up the suggestion, right? Because it wasn't directive, right? And it's just a reframing in how we speak so that we are heard. But if we don't know that, then we it perpetuates that kind of sense of feeling dismissed or excluded or paraphrased, for that matter. Yeah.
So what is the biggest thing that men don't understand about women?
Well, first of all, women are different. And you know what? It's a good thing. And I always say that it's a good thing. There's strength in our differences. So if men begin to see that actually the way that she thinks, so here's the fundamental difference between men and women. Men used to use convergent thinking when they're thinking. They converge on a problem. They look at the pros and cons in a very linear way. Women used to use divergent thinking. So you look at a larger context. They interconnect all kinds of things. So it becomes much more complex in how men hear it. And often that's dismissive because it's off the agenda, because it's divergent. If men begin to see that actually that divergent thinking creates more innovation, increases collaboration, reduces conflict, increases morale, and it does, by the way, we have 30 years of evidence of that. Boy, that's a win, right? That's a win for men. And men want to win. And women want to be understood and valued, right? While winning, right? So it's a real win-win to understand these differences. But that was the foundational difference, I would say. Convergent thinking versus divergent thinking. If you can just leave with that, you will have new eyes to see things, and you'll get an enrichment of ideas from women and women's brains that you would normally have dismissed. I'm speaking to men right now. Yeah.
One would think that women would be more open to what you're sharing than men would. Is that true?
It's very interesting. I thought that in the beginning when I started, but the neuroscience really, men loved the science. I mean, it was just fascinating. And they would say things like, why didn't I know this 20 years ago? I would have been a different father or different boss or different colleague or partner. I hear this all the time, all over the world. That neuroscience really opened them up. And women found the neuroscience so validating. They'll say things like, oh, I thought there was something wrong with me. I've had a coach for 3 to 5 years, to try and figure out what the heck is going on with me, right? I'm just wired differently, and I need to really practice self-care. And this is back to what Donese does so brilliantly, is how to really practice that self-care in a gender intelligent way, So there's a real richness here and a real freedom here.
There is. And, in speaking with couples that will come to me sometimes, I'm working on their mental, emotional health with them and their physical health, but they'll come as a couple sometimes, and you see the struggle. And I love that I bring in Barbara and saying her work taught me also. And I tell them, and it opens the door for men. I say, listen, here's the difference in your brains. You want it in a nutshell? Women's brains are always wiring and firing. They're always going. They really pretty much just don't shut off. Men can completely shut off most of their brain. The only part that's still working is in the back if they have their eyes open. So when a woman says to a man, what are you thinking? And he says nothing, and the woman gets very upset, it's real. Men can shut off, turn away, shut their brain down. That's how they make more testosterone. That's how they can do that. But women never really believed it. So now they go, okay, I understand there's a communication issue here because of the function of how our brains work. Then it opens the door for men and women to start having the conversation they need to have.
And it's really important what Donese is saying, because back to what you're saying about testosterone, men need to take that space out. They need to take that time out to replenish their testosterone. And women need to talk it out, vent it, to replenish their oxytocin, which is our distress hormone. So it's a real, how can we create that win-win in our relationship? I'm married to a judge. He's been a judge for a long time. And prior to that, I'm obviously a lawyer. And he comes home and I know he needs that time. It could be 7 minutes. It doesn't have to be a long time. But I know that he needs that time out, just the paper or whatever, watch the sports or whatever. And I need to talk things through, right? And we create that congruence in our relationship. And it works. It's a beautiful dance if we don't resist these differences, but actually embrace them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Dr. Worden, you do a lot of lecturing, and you're lecturing to a lot of men. I mean, is this something that you have kind of naturally embodied and changed your language when you're talking to men as opposed to a room full of women? Or is this something new to you?
In the last few years, somewhat new, but I will tell you, always in lecturing to physicians, mostly now I'm doing more public, but to physicians and mostly men in that room, I had to start out with the science. I had to establish credibility, or at least I thought I did at the beginning. Okay, she knows what she's talking about. She understands the science and the biology and physiology she's teaching us. I trust her. And then I could bring on my personality. Then I could make them laugh, actually enjoy the lecture and not be bored by a bunch of science. But I had to establish that first. So I don't know with Barbara in the workplace too, is that the way we're still having to, and that's what I need to flush out as well. Do I need that establishment right up front with the hard science with men still? I feel that I do. Maybe I don't. And I'm playing with it is the answer.
How do the men respond to you when it is mainly men you're talking to, and you go in and you present the science and then the personality? How do they respond?
They enjoy my lectures. That's why I'm very popular on the CME continuing medical education lecture. But I will tell you, there was one male, I think I was in UCLA. It's the only time it's ever happened. I had a huge audience. I was giving the science. I was doing all of this. And there was a male MD in the back that asked a very rude, in a very unprofessional, rude way, question at the end. I answered it. He continued to go after me. And finally, I didn't have to defend myself. The audience did it for me. Both male and female turned around and told him pretty much to shut up because he was disrespectful. So really, I think it's how you present yourself as well. I thought I was going to have to defend, but I really didn't have to. The audience did it for me because I had established a trust with them and a credibility and a liking that, I actually might like her as well. Not just a teacher, but I might like her.
Barbara, you share some great stories, very illustrative stories in your book. There was the wonderful story about the woman who did all the work, was going to an international conference, and then her boss just took the paperwork and said, fine, I've got it. And She was as pissed as hell.
Yes, she was.
Absolutely. And the advice you gave her was?
Well, first of all, a little more deeper to the story. Well, first of all, is to make the request saying, I got this, right? And step in and not fold. She folded in that moment, right?
But that's natural for many women.
Absolutely. You're in that moment and you fold and then after that you ruminate about it. And she was so upset. By the time she was in Europe. By the time she flew back to Silicon Valley, I was on a call with her. She was just ready to blow, and quit and, etc. The reason that I gave that story is it happens so often is that women tend to do the grunt work. They'll prepare the deck, prepare the presentation, etc. And men gets on stage. It still happens today, and it's back to what Dr. Donese was talking about, which is that credibility factor, that we have to build it. She also hadn't built her credibility factor with her boss. She didn't explain how many hours she had spent on researching that deck. It was 11 slides, but the amount of hours she had put into each slide, so she could answer the questions. And in that presentation actually failed. He said he got this, but he actually failed because he could not answer the questions. And she was sitting against the wall, chomping at the bit, wanting to say, wait, I got it, right? So it's a huge frustration. But I see it often where still you see today panels around the world of men and then a token woman. Yeah. But when you actually see who's taking the airtime on the panel, it's the men still. Yeah. And, it is shifting, thank goodness. But it is back to what Dr. Donese said. We need to build our credibility up front, saying, I know what I'm saying. Paul Frederick, who's a sociologist, said a wonderful quote. He said, when a man stands up and speaks, people listen. When a woman stands up and speaks, if they like what they see, they listen. Right? There's that added scrutiny that women still have to go through, unfortunately. And as women are younger, they have an even greater challenge. I mean, I'm sure you do brilliant young female doctors who are brilliant, right? I had an example of my dog got hit by a car and was really, really hurt. And there were two veterinarians and they were women and they looked like they were 19. But I had to check my bias, and I had to really listen and say, whoa, they know their stuff. But my initial reaction was, I want a 50-year-old to treat.
I want experience. That's right.
I want experience now, right? So
a funny story, you guys, is my patients now will come in. I have all ages, but I'll have older patients and they go, well, you're really young. And I think I'm in my 60s, but they are still thinking they were sitting in front of a young doctor that they want experience. They'd rather have the experience. When I tell them, look, I've been doing this a long time, how old I am, then all of a sudden it's okay. I'll listen. Now I'll listen. It's very funny.
Youth loses its well, it doesn't have any credibility. I mean, we say that about policemen, don't we? Oh, the policemen are getting younger. Nobody respects policemen anymore.
Right?
Yeah. Well, young doctors too, to your point, Aunt Barbara, is that they're smart, they're sharp, they've gone to school, but they don't have the years of experience. That does add an extra layer. It really does. And I am biased. Sometimes I want both. I want an opinion from both. The experience is different than the book learning. Yeah. It is, for sure. Especially in medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I really want to dive into this a bit more. I'd like our viewers and listeners to go away with some strategies that they can begin to start employing straight away. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and I'm speaking with world-renowned expert on gender diversity and inclusive leadership, Barbara Annis, and naturopathic medical doctor, research scientist, and global health educator, Dr. Donese Worden. And we're talking about the latest scientific research into the biological differences that determine how men and women relate to and operate in the world. We'll be back with more from Barbara Annis and Dr. Donese Worden after this break.
Omtimes TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Omtimes Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform. with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Omtimes offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Omtimes magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Omtimes TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Omtimes radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Omtimes. Open yourself to the possibilities.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back. Barbara Annis, tell us about blind spots. We all have them. We don't know what they are. What do we need to be looking out for?
Well, several blind spots, first of all, is, and I really want to share this around the brain differences, because the prefrontal cortex, as an example, is often lands as a blind spot, because women will say something like this. They'll go, I don't think this is a good idea. And men will go, what are you talking about? Blind spot for men. Women will say, I don't have a good feeling about this. And I remember an engineer saying to a group of women, saying, we don't have time for thoughts and feelings at work. We're just taking action, just action. Prefrontal cortex is the consequential thinking of the brain. It's the executive function of the brain. Women and girls develop it earlier than boys, around 12 to 14 in boys. And now, by the way, recently, Dr. Donese, I just heard 6 months ago, that it's even later in, I thought it was 18 to 22. It could be now up to 30 years old that it develops in men, male brain. So what does that tell us? Women are much more risk-wise, and men are greater risk takers. They don't think of the consequences when they take certain actions. So a combination of men and women working and winning together is that women can kind of provide that kind of, wait a minute, long-term view of, if we do this, this could have this impact. Studies. There's a 40-year study done in the police force on when women work with men, police officers together, and women are at the front line in some emergency situations, it actually diffuses the cases. And when men are at the front line, it escalates it completely. That's one simple example around the prefrontal cortex that we really need to understand. And we see it in the stock market when young men are taking these risk-taking early in the morning where their cortisol level, and you could speak to that, Dr. Donese, cortisol levels through the roof, they're taking these risks, uncalculated, not thoughtful in terms of the long-term implications of that short-term risk-taking. So that's one big blind spot that I see at home and in the workplace.
Dr. Donese, tell me a little bit more about the chemistry here.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to say first, I mean, if there's a tiger charging at you, I pretty much want the male brain involved at that moment, because he's not going to think about what's happening around him. He's going to go for defense and shoot the arrow. A female, we might be thinking, what do I want to do? How am I going to protect everybody? And that moment of hesitation could be life-threatening. So cortisol is the stress hormone. It's adrenaline, the powerful hormone that we hear about mothers lifting cars off their babies. It's powerful hormones. All of these stress hormones are supposed to be there when we're running from a bear or saving something under a stressful situation. It's supposed to not be there when we're relaxed. So it's how the brain utilizes it, when and how, and those differences in male and female, we do see it. When I do hormone testing, first morning when you wake up, cortisol is supposed to be a certain level. It's supposed to go up within 30 minutes and then start calming down within an hour and stay in its range throughout the day. I find on my testing that a lot of men have more cortisol as soon as they wake up, and they have a different pattern than women. And I think it's a function of women get up and we're thinking immediately, what do we need to do? But we may take more pause for the moment in the moment in the morning before we start running from that bear. So that's a hypothesis at this point.
One
But
thing
what
I'd love to add to that is I always say to women, if you're going to negotiate with men, don't do it in the morning.
yeah, that's right.
Wait till the afternoon. You're
Right.
going to far better negotiation solutions if you do it
That's
in
right.
the afternoon.
They're ready. They're in fight or flight mode.
They are. Amygdala is on fire. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
these things are really important in our communication because, we just go at it with one another sometimes without even thinking, reacting to whatever is going on or
Yes.
whatever is frustrating or irritating us. But if we understood, now's not the right time to do that.
Yeah.
Or if you approached it in a completely different way, the cortisol levels might drop and he might be more willing to listen to you.
Yes.
And
One of the
Sandy,
things-
for your community, we've been studying the meditation sex differences in meditators since 2008. Very well done MRI studies. We know there are differences in the brain changes that happen. We all get better. We get larger and more functional, more neurons connecting in the hippocampus when we're meditators. But men, really, it goes across both left and right hemispheres of that particular organ, the hippocampus, and that has to do with mood, learning, and memory. Men go more toward the left, the logical brain. Women really start developing more of the right brain, the intuitive section. So in meditation, we see there are differences. We're not quite sure what to do with it yet, but men, they start developing different assets from the meditation than women do with the same kind of meditation.
What about hormones? I mean, women's hormones tend to fluctuate. We don't know, certainly the average person doesn't know, what kind of hormones apart from testosterone, are driving a man's behavior. But does that come into it as well?
Well, everyone's hormones fluctuate. However, women, especially in childbearing years or perimenopausal time, they're a little off. They make us a little bit different than our normal thinking. So hormones do play into it. Men are more testosterone driven, right? But they also have estrogen and progesterone. So hormones are a little more delicate in their ups and downs in females, but that's why the reasoning for not including women in studies at the very beginning, like Barbara brought up, was because how are you going to study it? At what time in the menstrual cycle are we going to study this? So let's leave women out because the hormones are so fluctuating. Let's just study men because they're stable. They are more stable in their hormone fluctuations. That's why we got left out. So yes, it does play into it. All the hormones and cortisol, thyroid hormone, adrenaline, they all play in, not just the sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. So when we look at a person that's struggling, we really look at all the hormones. And there is a very big difference in male and female.
Barbara, you have a section in your book, Why Men and Women Live in Different Realities, Perception as Filters. And you talk about men's and women's sore toes. Speak to that a little bit.
So I speak about sore toes in the sense that we don't tend to see people's sore toes, right? Because we tend to have shoes on. And sometimes when we have a sore toe and we stumble on it, it just erupts, right? And we get overreactive. And sometimes men think that women are overreactive when they feel either dismissed or excluded, right? But there is this water torture syndrome that we've experienced over, sometimes decades or years, right, of the same kind of challenges. And it gets super frustrating, right? And that's why I always say, if you can understand the top challenges that women experience, the top challenges men experience. So here they are. So again, as I mentioned, women tend to feel excluded. So that's the real meaning after the meeting or the topic of the conversation, sports or something like that. Women tend to feel dismissed. And that is, again, I state an idea, it's repeated or restated or reframed, right? And women feel they have to fit in, right? In terms of speaking like a man. I do have to do men speak. I often hear women say, I feel like I'm a foreigner. When I go to work, I feel like I'm a foreigner in my own country, because I feel I have to take this suit of armor and be a certain way. And I you might think that that's the baby boomer challenge, but I hear it in young women. And it's so interesting. I had a young woman, she was in her late 20s. She said, my mother thinks I've changed. And I said, how? She said, I come home, she says, I'm harder. I'm more direct. I'm tougher. I'm dressing differently. I'm not wearing skirts anymore, you know, and I have this edge to me. And I said, and that's just not me, you know. And so she felt like she'd kind of been forced into that. And that's a 20 something that is feeling that, right? Now, the challenges for men is, again, they feel, first of all, men feel blamed. So when you think about gender equality or, you know, you just don't understand or these kind of things, men feel blamed for being men. And I always say, let's honor our differences and not blame our differences, right? And then again, men feel careful and confused. One of the things that I look at when you look at conflict, because these could be conflictual situations when these things happen, is I love the acronym that Dr. Virginia Satir, which is in my book, called SARA. And it stands for Sarah, S-A-R-A. So when an upset happens or a challenge occurs, or a blind spot for that matter, between men and women, we go through these different feeling stages. One is shock. Oh my goodness, what happened? The shock. And then there's anger, and then there's rejection, and then there's acceptance. Men, when things are unresolved, men tend to get stuck in anger, and women tend to get stuck in rejection. And when that occurs and we don't get into acceptance and we act out of that, it just escalates the conflict, right? Because she's seeking understanding because she feels rejected, and he's angry, defensive, right? Which gets her more rejected. So I always say, don't take any action or say anything. Don't text, don't email, don't do anything until you've reflected on it and gotten to acceptance. You have a whole different line of sight when you could see it from that perspective. And I always use a personal example, for example, with my husband, Paul. You know, when I'm upset, I'll say, you know what? I'll get back to you on that Monday at noon. And I want to talk about it until Monday at noon, you know, and then noon we talk about it. And it takes 5 minutes. If I'd done it before that, it would take much longer and it would just have escalated, right? So it's a good framework to use.
Yeah. The thing is that women tend to want to resolve it straight away, and they can't rest until
Yes.
they have. Whereas, and that's probably the wrong thing to do.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, men need that space, that time out, right? Often it takes boys, for example, psychologists, it takes boys up to 7 hours to sort out what they're feeling about something. And girls and women can speak about their feelings right there. I feel this. It's instant, right? And it's harder for boys and for men to do that. So we also have to give each other space, you know, to do that as well.
I think the other thing that surprised me in the book is, you know, how women take everything personally. It's all personal, and men don't.
Yeah, it really is. So if one thing you could take away as women is this thing about us internalizing things. See, women ruminate. So when something goes wrong, we tend to ruminate. Now, let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience. The hippocampus in the brain is larger in women, and that's the memory centers of the brain. So we retain a lot of emotional content in our brain. We remember everything. Relational memory. Men have brilliant memory when it comes to factual memory. They can remember stats, sport, you know, scores, all cars, all kinds of statistical things, right? But the relational side of it doesn't compute as well for men. So I just had a perfect example of this, of a woman that spoke to me about her relationship. And I'm Danish and she's from Copenhagen as well. She's a friend. And I said, and she said, she texted me and she said, I will turn my back if he ever does this again. And I go, okay. And then I got on the phone with her and I said, when did he do this again? And she went, in 1982. Okay. 1982. I said, has he ever done that since? She goes, no, but if he ever does, I'm turning my back. So we get stuck in this memory, you know, and we ruminate and we personalize it and we internalize it. So if we can just say, and I say this to myself all the time, it's not personal. It's not, he's having his little snowstorm over there. I don't take snowstorms personally, do I? No. So let him have his little snowstorm, right? So we don't internalize it, because it's, back to Dr. Donese, the stress level when we ruminate is just so costly to our health.
It is. It is. And we forget that simple things of those tools that we're talking about, Sandy. Laughter is huge. Barry and I, my husband, we start to get into something and we've learned, we've become emotionally intelligent about this and now gender intelligent about all of this. But we laugh and we'll call each other our parents. Like I'll say, well, you're acting like Ben, or that was a Ben comment, or I'll say he'll say to me, that was a Don, my dad comment. And we've learned to laugh because we recognize quickly what's going on. And then we turn it into humorous about our differences, gender intelligence differences. And then we can work through it, or we wait, like Barbara said, we say, okay, let's laugh about this. Let's come back to it later and we'll discuss it. So it's been important. And then music, as you know, Sandy and Barbara as well, music is a great way when that stress is coming in. We're trying to decide what to do or how to do it. Music is a great way to shift your emotion very quickly out of where are you and where do you want to go? Music is one of the fastest ways, because to tell a man to meditate immediately, that can be more stressful for them. In fact, the studies show that men sometimes, when they're trying to meditate and when they're stressed, it actually makes them more stressed.
Yes.
Women, it helps. So we've got to be careful of not saying, does everybody go quiet your mind and meditate? I really think music is a key.
Very important.
Yeah. Do you find, Barbara, that although you say that men are in the workplace that you speak to are very open to this, that it's women who read your books?
Yes, definitely. And that's consistent with any personal development books. Between 80 and 9% are read by women. It doesn't mean that women don't hand it over and say, take a look at this, right? John Gray, Women from Mars, Women from Venus, Men from Mars, he sold 50 million books, 50 million books. And I asked him, when I co-authored the book, The 8 Blind Spots for Men and Women in the Workplace, I asked him, what percentage of women bought it? He said 92%. And I said, do you think the men? He said, oh yeah, the women would pass it over, or they would read it together, or they would join a workshop with that I led. So the men do get engaged, but yeah, definitely women are the readers and the learners.
Well, same with medical care. Men don't come. Generally, if I have a male come, I'll say, they have to be in extreme pain or very afraid, or they have cancer. Otherwise, I say, what woman drug you here? It's literally the reason why they will not come.
Yeah. I watched a very interesting little play out in my house the other day. My son had been somewhere with my grandson, football match or whatever it was, and there was some people there, and he was telling his wife that he was talking to so and so's mum, and she said, and what did you learn? And he gave her one little piece, and she said, well, what did you learn about the family? What did you learn about this? What did you learn about that? And it was absolutely classic, because, a woman will find out everything and the man will only find out what's useful to know.
That's absolutely correct. And it's often very frustrating, because women misinterpret men as not caring, because men aren't as explorative as women are, right? And I can remember my husband, best friend, called him a few years back and said, Angela's leaving me. Let's go for a beer. And so I'm on pins and needles for a couple of hours, and he comes home. And I said, so what happened? Where's Angela? What happened? He said, oh, we didn't talk about it.
Yeah, that's right. Drink a beer.
What do you mean we didn't talk about it? No, we were just hanging out. So.
Yeah. The subtle nuances. I think women are much more interested in everything.
Women show a different way of caring, exploring to show empathy and concern, and men tend to respect the person's independence and privacy and not wanting to pry. So they both have the best of intentions, right? It's just a difference. That I always say, Mother Teresa's quote, understanding means there's nothing to forgive. And I think that's if we just understand and we just learn about this, everything will just reduce down. I mean, I can't remember the last time I've had arguments, because I've just been able to exercise this muscle of understanding, of standing in the other person's shoes and really listen and gain more insight to really understand some of these differences, right?
Yeah. One of the things I always try to bear in mind is Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements. Mm-hmm. It's not personal.
Yes.
Because I know that I will always take responsibility for something. It's my fault. It's all about me, and I have to think it's not personal.
Yes.
If you were to offer people some advice right now, small pieces of advice, but life-changing advice, what would it be?
First of all, I would say 3 things, right? Make no assumptions, right? Don't resist this learning. So there's a lot of conversation around binary, all of that non-binary conversation.
Mhm.
When we talk about gender intelligence, we're talking about sex differences, biological differences. When you talk about gender, it could be nurture, and there could be a whole host of different differences. We're talking about 95% of us either have XX or XY chromosomes, and that's a 95% of the population. It would be really useful to understand the biology of these differences. So I would say, make no assumptions. Don't resist the learning. There's such deep learning for you, whether you are wife, partner, parent, boss, colleague, friend. There's that deep learning. And then let's stand in each other's shoes and really listen. Really listen. There's nothing more powerful when men and women feel heard and understood. I really see that. Yeah, that's it.
Dr. Worden,
Yeah, I
from
would
which
say
angle
too,
would you come at this?
well, that certainly what Barbara's saying is rings true for most people. I think they understand it, and then it's like, how do I do it? How will I accomplish this? That goes back to your self-care. That goes back to, you also need to be understanding of yourself. If you know you, if you know yourself well, then you can manage these things. You can learn and you can make changes. You can teach an old dog new tricks. You can. But the way you do it is, we have to understand ourselves at a deeper level. So that's doing the spiritual work, the mental, emotional work, and the physical work to get yourself to the place where you know who you are. When you do, the learning comes, and then the relationships come and become much easier. Because if you're still struggling with your own identity, it's going to be hard to play with others in the sandbox nicely.
I would love to add one more thing that you just spurred as an insight for me, Dr. Donese, is the worry.
Mhm.
Women worry a lot.
Yes.
And often when women worry in the workplace, men think that women lack confidence.
Yeah.
Really important to understand that. It's not true. It's not that we are failing. We just see more into situations. We're worried about our team. Sheryl Sandberg, who's recently resigned, you may have different opinions about her, but she said burnout. I did a study last year, and I said, well, there was some very simple survey, yes or no. Do you feel burned out? 92% of women said they felt burned out.
Yeah.
And then we did 82 focus groups around that, and we found that women over worry, right? We over worry about everything. And part of that is our female rumination of personalizing, internalizing. So really, I always say, commit yourself to short-term suffering. So what I say to myself, okay, is it going to be useful for me to worry about this right now? Will it make any difference whatsoever? Is there any cheese down that tunnel? And if I say no, I let it go. Let it go. If you can't make an impact, let it go. And that's back to Dr. Denise talking about self-care, that we can really practice that self-care and not fall into that trap of over worrying.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that is so fundamental to life. It really does need to be taught in schools, doesn't it?
Yes.
How do we do that? How do we, how can you expand this into schools? I mean, you've already changed and pioneered so much change and transformation in the workplace, but what about getting them when they're really young?
Well, we actually partnered with Pearson Education, which is the #1 educational company in the world. And we have developed a e-learning, digital learning that we are offering next October, unfortunately not September, but October, for free to schools. So it's called Be Gender Intelligent. And it's an interactive, gamification type of learning. So that I really wish that teachers would take that on, because we really find that in elementary school, actually, about 90% or 95% are young women teachers or female teachers. And they're misinterpreting boys in how they learn, because boys learn differently than girls. And boys are being interpreted as having attention deficit disorder when they just learn differently. They can't sit still. They can't pay attention as much. Too many words at boys, or men for that matter, tune out. Boys and men tune out if there's bombarded with too many words. And that type of. So it's really important that gender intelligence, I wish we knew it in day one, So there are many, many books out there by Dr. Leonard Sachs, Why Gender Matters, that talk about Michael Gurian, The Wonder of Boys, The Wonder of Girls. Some really good books that you could read that talks about the younger generation and how parents can be gender intelligent. But I agree, it needs to be in schools, and put me out of business. That would be great.
What about, we're seeing huge growth in transgender.
Yes.
Many of our youth are, very curious about and maybe experimenting, or maybe know that they internally feel that they're the opposite gender. How does this work? If somebody feels they're transgender, how does the neurology work?
Yeah, I know Dr. Donese can speak to this, but I'll kick it off. So yeah, we're seeing definitely a shift there. There are a lot of doctors that have a huge concern about the age of when that decision is being made, because the prefrontal cortex hasn't developed, the brain hasn't developed, and there is this sense, especially girls or some boys, feeling disconnected in that. We see a lot of girls today in California. There's actually a plastic surgeon that his only practice is to remove breasts of 11-year-old girls.
Yeah.
It's his brand. I can't remember what it's called, sizing or something like that.
So, yeah.
It's just crazy. Dr. Leonard Sachs, actually, anyone who wants to go online and look at Dr. Leonard Sachs' work, he talks a lot about that and his concern about the timing of that. It doesn't mean that there aren't people, men and women, who need to and want to transgender. And then there's another man online, amazing human being, Transpa, he's called Transpa instead of Grandpa. He transgendered in his 40s, he's in his 60s. And he says that as a man, and he looks like a man, he says that he still feels he's wired as a woman inside. And it's really created a lot of chaos for him in his life. So there's huge complexity. Yes, we need to understand and honor the ones who authentically want and need to do that. But I think there's such a morass of confusion of the timing of it in terms of its age. And that's what Dr. Leonard Sachs really contributes greatly. I don't know, Dr. Donese, if you have anything to add.
No, I agree with that. You were bringing up that we now know that the male brain, especially, it's in the 30s. We used to think it was younger before it's fully developed. How are you going to make life altering and changing decisions when we don't have that full capacity yet? So that's of concern. And how many of us at whatever age have a really strong self-identity to make those kinds of changes? So as children, that is worrisome. I think we're letting things happen a little too soon, in my opinion. But again, it's a personal choice. It's an honor, and we've got to roll with the punches here, guys. But I will say that honoring and understanding that sexuality, sexual preferences and all that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a brain difference in gender intelligence that you can see in utero after how many months is it, Barbara? 3 to 4?
Second and third trimester.
Third trimester, we can see the brain and know whether it's functioning as a male or female because of these structural changes, structural differences that we're talking about. So that's real. That's a physical, mechanical reality. It's not necessarily sexuality.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time and we're going to have to leave it here. But this is such a fascinating subject and such an important one. I'd really like to be kept abreast of anything else that's emerging and talk about it some more later on.
Absolutely. I'm open to that anytime. Thank you.
Good. Well, Barbara Annis, Dr. Donese Worden, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Barbara Annis's book, Same Words, Different Language, a proven guide for creating gender intelligence at work, not just for work, but for relationships too, is published by Pearson's. For more information about Barbara's work, visit genderintelligence.com. And you can learn more about Dr. Donese Worden at drwarden.com, which is DRWORDEN. That's it for today's show. I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.